Money FM 89.3, the best of the afternoon update.
Money FM 89.3, you're with me, Lynn Lee, and this is Industry Insight. The global critical minerals industry is on a growth trajectory, with reports stating that demand is expected to increase dramatically in the coming decades, from 7.1 million tons in 2020 to 42.3 million tons in 2050. One of the main drivers of this growth is decarbonisation efforts, because clean energy technologies depend on large quantities of critical minerals. The International Energy Agency has estimated that the transition towards net zero will triple the demand for critical minerals by 2030, and with the energy transition gathering pace, an uninterrupted supply of critical minerals and metals are vital. While there are many institutions, such as the US Geological Survey, the British Geological Survey, the International Energy Agency, and more, that publish data around the top producers of critical minerals, such as cobalt, lithium, nickel, and copper, and which countries have reserves that can be mined in the future, it's still hard to get a quick overview of global production and reserves. So on today's Industry Insight, we have an expert on our show who will shed light on the critical minerals industry. Marc Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services, joins me now. Welcome, Marc. Great to have you here to discuss the current trade landscape, its impact on industries and potential strategies, such as supply chain diversification and local production. Marc, first off, you're in Singapore for Commodity Trading Week, which is a gathering of industry leaders, experts and stakeholders in commodity trading in the Asia-Pacific region. If you could share with us, what are some of the key themes dominating the conversations at this conference?
The more general themes are, first of all, Donald Trump and trade wars. They did a quick straw poll at the first plenary yesterday morning, and basically the thing which came out as likely to be the dominant themes are volatility, a lot of it induced by trade tensions. And I think the other very dominant theme, in contrast to recent years, and clearly also in part influenced by the advent of Donald Trump and in the swing to the right that we saw in a lot of the elections in Europe last year, is a pushback on EUDR, that's the EU directive on the environment, and ESG in general, that people are definitely pushing back on that. They're placing less emphasis on it. I think, as one gentleman actually put on one of the panels I was speaking on this morning, it's actually a good thing, because now, instead of setting unrealistic targets, which are being set by politicians or civil servants who largely don't really have a deep understanding of the industries that they're impacting, particularly not along the supply chain. And as he said, yeah, it's good, because instead of actually trying to hit a target, we'll now actually get down to doing the proper maths and the proper research to actually guide us. The train has left the station, there's no question about it, but constricting it with regulation, constricting it with targets is actually not the best way of doing that. There was obviously a lot of political will there, particularly within Europe.
Okay, Marc, clearly lots to talk about. So let's backtrack a little bit. I touched a bit on clean energy transition efforts and the case for critical minerals earlier, but it is more than just that, isn't it? We're talking about electronics, transportation, and defense, among other industries that depend on critical minerals. So from your perspective, what exactly are critical minerals, and why are they so crucial for global economies, particularly in Asia, for our listeners who may not be so familiar with this industry?
Well, for Asia, it's as simple as this. Asia is the engine of global growth, be that Southeast Asia, be it China, be it India, even Australia, Japan, South Korea. So there's a lot of manufacturing. It is the manufacturing hub of the world without any shadow of a doubt. But let's quick discussion about what exactly are critical minerals. Actually, as I think a lot of people are coming to the conclusion about, particularly within the industry, critical minerals as a description is really very bad. Because really what it's trying to describe, a critical mineral is a core mineral, but the critical ones are the ones that you or your allies don't have the control over the supply of. Obviously, one of the countries which has managed its supply chains on that front the best in the past 3 decades is China. And China basically has control over that. Now, latterly, as Europe and North America seek to, whatever they would like, nearshore, onshore manufacturing production, so they've obviously discovered that a lot of the critical minerals which go into, for instance, car batteries or any form of battery technology, which is going to be the future for energy, are not readily available and in a lot of cases controlled by China because of what it's done. It's been all over Africa. It's been across many parts of Asia and indeed South America to ensure that it has these supplies, to ensure that the freight networks to get it over to China are available, as well as doing a lot of the investing in. So critical minerals, if you've got access to things like copper, which is readily available everywhere, that's fine. There are other things where the processing, for instance, lithium, which is an absolute core mineral in terms of battery technology, that is less readily available. And when we start talking about critical minerals, in a lot of cases, you then have to start thinking about how realistic is it that either Europe, with what's been revealed to be a very defective energy network, which it's trying to adapt, and North America, can they realistically go down the route of producing, securing all the critical minerals to complete the batteries as but one example? And the answer is probably not, but it's not actually really down to the securing of supplies of critical minerals. It's above all, is there access to cheap energy? What are the laws in terms of, what do you have to do? One person was explaining a thing this morning. He said, in conjunction with the German government and the EU, we went into an investigation of setting up a plant in Germany. And he said, at the EU level, we had some backing. They were also giving some incentives. At a national level, we had the backing of the federal government. But then when we started identifying sites, we actually found there are a lot of problems with local municipalities. So it goes beyond actually just the source of critical minerals.
Okay, fascinating, but also a bit concerning. Are there alternatives to China's dominance in the supply chain? Can other Asian countries perhaps play a bigger role?
I think for Asia, actually, it's not really a problem. This is really very much a European and a North American problem. Most of Asia is very integrated with China. There are obviously countries which are more sensitive, like South Korea, like Japan, to the American relationship with China and may do certain things for themselves, which, other Asian countries would basically say, look, this is not our fight. We want to get on and do business. I mean, Singapore is an absolute classic example. What's actually happening now is that people are beginning to look at this in a slightly different way and realizing that maybe actually places like Southeast Asia, but above all the Middle East, countries which have maintain good relationships not only with China but with the United States, with Europe, and even with Russia, because they want to do business. Whether the political landscape is basically not one about ideology or big swings, it is basically, look, we want to be involved in this, so how are we going to do this? Let's do some business.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the importance of critical minerals in the U.S.-China trade dynamic. You were saying you were hearing a lot about trade wars at this conference you attended.
Yes. I mean, the concern there is basically if the U.S. wants to onshore things. And, I think they may actually get to a point where we will worry about some of these critical minerals. But then when you actually get down to a corporate level rather than the political will level, corporates will look at it and say, well, is it realistic that we can produce this here? It's all very well for Mr. Trump to say, as an example, during Trump 1.0 from 2017 to 2020, he implemented steel and aluminium tariffs as an example. Did one old aluminium smelter reopen? No, it didn't. And that is an example of the facts on the ground. At the end of the day, it's a little bit like the Trump mantra about drill, baby, drill. Sure, in terms of natural gas, because there's going to be a big increase, because you always need a backstop, because solar and wind power are intermittent sources. They're not constant sources. So you always need something which provides a backdrop. So natural gas, yes. On the oil front, U.S. oil production's gone up about 20% in the last 2.5 years. The idea that it's now around about 12.5 million barrels per day, the idea that they could add another 3 million is very unrealistic at current prices, and also given where we're actually going in terms of oil demand. The world is talking about peak Chinese oil demand. Now, I do want to make one thing very clear here. There's a bit of conflation going on, which shouldn't happen. It's not because the Chinese economy is going ex-growth. It is because they are so far ahead in terms of the energy transition that they've also moved a lot of their freight away from diesel trucks to LNG, liquefied natural gas-powered trucks. And therefore, their demand for oil products is starting to fade quite naturally. So it's a changing background. For corporate America and indeed for corporate Europe, I think that at the corporate level, a lot of people will be saying, this is not a battlefield I'm going to die on. It's simply just not worth the effort. Apart from anything else, China's technological development in the processing of a lot of rare earths, amongst other things, which go into some of the batteries and also into a lot of the mechanics of renewable machinery, that we need to do the research, first of all, to catch up with them so we can. We then need to establish the supply chain. And once we've done all that, we may actually get into a situation where they might be able to try and compete. But that could be a process of 5 to 10 years. And we know that there are political cycles which will go on in the meantime, and we may swing in a completely different direction. So that's another reason why a lot of businesses will basically say, yeah, but is this just part of the cycle now, this business cycle, influenced by this set of politicians, or do we have a longevity, something where we can look at a proper investment project and establish that as a long-term source of revenues and profits. And those are much bigger considerations than anything that any politician says, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else.
Which brings me to my next point, Mark. So what are the biggest risks and challenges industries are facing due to these escalating trade tensions?
I mean, there's 3 or 4 areas, I think, where one has to watch very carefully, and they're very important ones and they're very big. The most likely impacted ones are the automobile sector. By extension, that also stretches over into the semiconductor manufacturing sector, and then agriculture. And then you have to also look at the countries where the tariffs are not balanced. Vietnam, India, Brazil, South Korea are the ones which have much higher tariffs on incoming US goods than the US have of imports of the goods that they export. But in a lot of cases, yes, South Korea obviously is quite capable of making concessions and basically doing deals with Mr. Trump to import more agricultural goods, to import more natural gas. Vietnam, on the other hand, rather more difficult. And so there are vulnerabilities and potential disruptions there. One has to always, though, bear in mind, this is a negotiating tactic, even if, one might call it machine gun etiquette, in that Mr. Trump doesn't sort of play nice, go and shake hands with people. He waves the gun at them and says, come to the negotiating table, which, is not very pleasant for any country in the world, but, that's the way he does things. We're used to it from Trump 1.0, and, we will just have to deal with it as it comes along. But those particular areas, automobiles, anything which involves semiconductors, are going to be the ones with the greatest vulnerability. To a certain extent, yes, hydrocarbons, but I don't really see that as being, given that we've got a huge amount of mothballed oil production amongst OPEC plus, whatever the US does, and does the US want to do damage to itself? Because if it actually cuts off the supply of oil or gas to other areas, Europe would obviously be the most vulnerable area to that. In all of this, actually, when you look at it, trade tensions, who is it going to hit most? Well, here's a little factoid on China.
Okay.
When the first set of tariffs were introduced in 2018, the US accounted for 28% of all Chinese exports. Because of those initial tariffs, because of the fact that they were actually maintained during the Biden regime largely, because of de-risking, actually Chinese exports to the US are now only 19%. So there is a good deal less sensitivity. And this also then goes back into what we were talking about Asia. It is because of the growth of trade with the rest of Asia that actually China is far less. 19% is still a vast amount. But it's a lot less than it was.
Okay. I'm very mindful of time, Mark, but I just want to get your thoughts on, this demand for these minerals is skyrocketing due to, like you mentioned, the EV revolution, shift to renewable energy. How do you see this demand shaping Asia's economic future?
I mean, Asia is in a good position, basically, to do a lot of this production. We've already seen some countries benefiting from the fact that Europeans and Americans, to some extent, don't want to see made in China. So instead, you get a Chinese company and it says made in Malaysia, made in Vietnam. So, Asia is still a huge engine of growth. It is going to benefit a lot from this. It's got a massive workforce. It is ideally placed in terms of, whether it wants to export to the Americas or whether it wants to export to Europe, particularly if we do have a little more peace now in the Middle East, hopefully. Then Asia is in a very good place to capitalize on opportunities that are emerging in the Gulf cooperation countries, which are expanding their non-oil activities at a very, very rapid rate with an enormous amount of investment. And it's good bilateral investment that's going on. So, yes, I think in a great place, basically.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for your insights. I do think that it seems like the critical minerals industry in Asia is not just an economic story, but a global one as well, involving geopolitical strategy, technological innovation, and perhaps even environmental stewardship. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. He is Marc Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.